But when she opened her eyes again, her face was set with grim determination. The past could not be changed, but the present still offered choices. She moved toward the emergency equipment locker, her steps purposeful despite the trembling in her hands. The cries came again, fainter now but still audible to ears that had learned to listen for sounds others might miss. Somewhere out there in the storm's fury, 3 young lives hung in the balance. The rational part of her mind catalogued all the reasons why venturing outside would be suicide: the wind speeds, the flying debris, the impossibility of navigation in such conditions. But louder than rational thought was a voice she had tried to silence for years, a voice that whispered of debts unpaid and chances at redemption. She began gathering equipment: emergency rope, a portable beacon, protective gear designed for extreme weather conditions. Her movements were swift and practiced, muscle memory taking over as conscious thought focused on the task ahead. The storm continued its assault on the outpost, but Elan no longer heard it as a barrier to action. Instead, she heard it as a countdown timer, marking seconds that could mean the difference between life and death for 3 innocent creatures who had never asked to be caught in the crossfire between human ambition and an unforgiving universe. The emergency airlock cycled through its sequence with agonizing slowness while Elan checked her equipment one final time. Emergency rope coiled around her torso, its synthetic fibers designed to withstand forces that would snap traditional materials. A portable beacon clipped to her belt, its power cell providing 12 hours of illumination and location transmission. Weather-sealed goggles protected her eyes, while a breathing apparatus filtered the charged particles that Alcaris 4 storms carried in deadly concentrations. The inner door sealed behind her with a sound like a coffin closing. Through the reinforced portal of the outer door, she could see the storm's fury made manifest: trees bending at impossible angles, debris streaming past like bullets, rain that fell not in drops but in sheets that seemed solid enough to walk on. The atmospheric readings on her suit's display showed wind speeds approaching the theoretical limits of the equipment's sensors. The outer door began its opening cycle, and immediately the airlock filled with the storm's voice, a sound like the planet itself screaming in pain. Wind pressure threatened to tear the door from its hinges despite the heavy-duty hydraulics. Elan braced herself against the chamber's rear wall, feeling the full weight of her decision settling over her like a physical burden. She had not spoken to another human being in the outpost about her intentions. There had been no time for explanations. No opportunity for others to try to stop her or insist on following protocols that would waste precious minutes. By the time anyone discovered her absence, she would either have succeeded in her mission or been claimed by the storm's fury. Both outcomes felt strangely appropriate. The door reached full aperture, and Elan launched herself into the maelstrom. The storm struck her like a physical blow, driving her to her knees on the outpost's entry platform. Wind speeds that her instruments could barely measure tore at her protective gear, seeking any weakness that might allow the tempest to claim another victim. Rain struck her face mask with the force of hammers, each droplet carrying enough kinetic energy to bruise exposed skin. She forced herself upright and began moving toward the perimeter of the human facility. Each step required tremendous effort, her boots fighting for purchase on surfaces made treacherous by wind-driven water and debris. The emergency beacon on her belt cast a weak circle of light that penetrated perhaps 3 meters into the storm-lashed darkness, enough to avoid the largest obstacles but insufficient for true navigation. Navigation had to come from memory and instinct. During her 3 years on Alcaris 4, Elan had memorized the terrain around the outpost with the thoroughness of someone who understood that knowledge of local geography could mean the difference between life and death. She knew that the rocky outcroppings where the cubs played lay approximately 400 meters to the northeast, following a path that wound between towering spiral trees and across two small streams that would now be raging torrents. The first of these streams nearly claimed her life. What had been a gentle brook that morning was now a torrent of muddy water carrying uprooted vegetation and chunks of stone. The crossing point she had planned to use was completely submerged, forcing her to work her way upstream until she found a narrow section where fallen logs created a precarious bridge. Halfway across, one of the logs shifted under her weight, tilting at an angle that would have dumped her into the churning water below. Only the emergency rope, quickly looped around a protruding branch, prevented her from being swept away. She hauled herself hand over hand to the opposite bank, her muscles burning with effort and her lungs fighting to process the storm-charged atmosphere. The cries came again as she reached solid ground, closer now but weaker than before. The sound cut through her consciousness like a blade, driving her forward despite exhaustion that was already beginning to cloud her judgment. 3 young lives depended on her ability to navigate conditions that challenged the limits of human endurance. The terrain became increasingly treacherous as she approached the rocky outcroppings. Loose stones, made slippery by the constant rain, shifted unpredictably under her feet. Twice she fell, catching herself with painful impacts that would leave bruises for weeks. The emergency beacon's light revealed a landscape transformed by the storm's violence, familiar landmarks obliterated by debris, paths she had walked countless times now unrecognizable, but she pressed forward, guided by sounds that grew progressively fainter with each passing minute. The cubs were weakening, their calls becoming less frequent and more desperate. Whatever predicament they had found themselves in was worsening, and time was running out for all of them. The final approach to the outcroppings required her to climb a slope that had become an impromptu waterfall. Runoff from higher elevations cascaded down the rocks in patterns that changed by the second, creating treacherous footing and limited visibility. She ascended slowly, testing each handhold before trusting her weight to it, knowing that a single mistake would send her tumbling back into the darkness below. At the crest of the ridge, her beacon's light finally revealed the source of the cries that had drawn her into the storm's embrace. A section of the rocky outcropping had collapsed, creating a depression filled with debris and rising water. Trapped within this impromptu prison were 3 small forms, the Rilvan cubs, their golden fur matted with mud and blood, their amber eyes reflecting her light with a mixture of hope and terror. They were alive, but barely. The eldest of the 3 lay partially pinned beneath a fallen stone, while the 2 smaller cubs huddled against their injured sibling for warmth and comfort. All 3 were calling out in their distress, their voices growing weaker as hypothermia and shock took their toll. Elan stood at the edge of the collapsed area, rain streaming down her face mask, and felt the weight of absolute responsibility settle over her shoulders. These 3 lives now depended entirely on her ability to overcome obstacles that seemed insurmountable, to find strength she was not certain she possessed, and to succeed where failure would mean not just her own death but the loss of innocence. Who had never asked to be part of humanity's presence on their world. The collapsed section created a natural pit approximately 4 meters deep and twice as wide, its walls slick with mud and debris that shifted constantly under the assault of cascading rainwater. The trapped cubs were positioned near the center of this depression, surrounded by chunks of stone that had once formed part of the elevated outcropping. Water was rising steadily around them, already reaching the level of their bellies as they struggled to maintain footing on increasingly unstable ground. Elan anchored her emergency rope to the most solid-looking formation she could identify, a spiral tree whose roots had somehow found purchase among the rocks. The synthetic cable would have to support not just her own weight during the descent, but also the additional burden of carrying 3 cubs back to safety. She tested the anchor point with several sharp tugs, then began fashioning a harness system that would allow her to transport multiple passengers. The descent began as a controlled rappel, but the conditions made conventional techniques nearly impossible. Wind gusts threatened to slam her against the pit's walls, while the constant flow of water made every surface treacherously slippery. Twice she lost her grip and slid several meters down the rope, the friction burning through her protective gloves and leaving her palms raw. As she reached the bottom of the pit, the cub's behavior surprised her. Rather than fleeing from this strange human who had invaded their prison, they pressed closer together and watched her approach with expressions that seemed almost hopeful. The largest cub, the one trapped beneath the fallen stone, made a sound that was part whimper, part purr, as if trying to communicate across the species barrier. Up close, Elan could see the full extent of their predicament. The stone pinning the eldest cub was roughly the size of a human torso, far too heavy for her to lift directly. But years of mechanical work had taught her the principles of leverage and force multiplication. She positioned a smaller piece of debris as a fulcrum and used a section of twisted metal as a lever. Applying steady pressure until the stone shifted enough to free the trapped cub's hindquarters, the rescued cub struggled to stand, favoring one hind leg but apparently free of serious injury. All 3 cubs now gathered around Elan, their instinctive fear overcome by recognition that she represented their only chance of escape. The water level continued to rise, now reaching mid-thigh on the human and nearly submerging the smallest cub entirely. Constructing an improvised carrier from her equipment required improvisation that would have impressed her engineering instructors. She used sections of the emergency rope to create a sling system that could hold 2 cubs securely against her torso, while the third, the largest and strongest, would need to climb on her back and hold on during the ascent. The arrangement was far from ideal, but it represented the only option that had any chance of success. Loading her passengers proved easier than expected. The cubs seemed to understand that cooperation was essential for survival, and they submitted to the unfamiliar restraints with remarkable patience. The weight of all 3 animals strained the limits of what Elan could carry, but adrenaline and determination provided strength that pure muscle could not. The ascent began as a nightmare of mud, water, and failing handholds. Every meter gained was a victory against physics and endurance. The rope, slick with rain and debris, slipped repeatedly through her burned palms. The cubs' combined weight threatened to tear the improvised harnesses apart, while their shifting movements made balance nearly impossible to maintain. Halfway up the pit's wall, disaster struck. The cub clinging to her back lost its grip and began to slide backward, its claws scrabbling desperately for purchase on her rain-soaked gear. Elan felt the additional weight pulling her away from the wall, threatening to send all 4 of them tumbling back into the rising water below. Without conscious thought, she released one hand from the rope and caught the falling cub, pulling it against her body with strength born of pure desperation. For several heartbeats, she hung from the rope with one hand while supporting nearly 40 kilograms of terrified alien wildlife with the other. Her shoulder joint screamed in protest, and she could feel her grip on the rope beginning to fail, but then the cub in her arms twisted around and buried its claws in her gear, finding its own handholds and reducing the burden on her failing strength. The other 2 cubs pressed closer against her torso, as if trying to merge their own determination with hers. For a moment that lasted an eternity, human and alien young clung together in a tableau of mutual dependence that transcended species. Boundaries, the final meters of the ascent blurred together in a haze of pain and exhaustion. Elan's hands were bleeding freely now, the emergency rope slick with her own blood as well as rainwater. Her muscles burned with the fire of approaching failure, and her vision began to tunnel as oxygen debt caught up with her body's demands, but the cub's trust gave her strength beyond her physical limits. They had placed their lives in her hands without reservation, and she could not, fail them as she had failed others in the past. When her arms threatened to give out entirely, she found reserves of determination she had not known existed. When the rope became too slippery to grip, she wrapped it around her wrists and accepted the additional pain as the price of progress. The rim of the pit appeared suddenly in her beacon's light, close enough to touch but still impossibly far away. One final effort, one last surge of will translated into motion, and she hauled herself and her passengers over the edge onto relatively solid ground. All four of them collapsed in a heap, gasping and trembling as the storm continued its assault around them, but they were alive. Against all odds and reasonable expectations, they were alive. The cubs pressed against her, their purring vibrations transmitted through her gear as they expressed gratitude in the only way they knew how. For the first time in years, Elan felt tears mixing with the rainwater on her face, tears of relief, of triumph, and of something that might have been hope. The journey back to the outpost became a blur of determination and shared survival. The cubs, no longer trapped but still vulnerable to the storm's fury, pressed close to Elan as she navigated the treacherous terrain. Their trust in her was absolute now, their small body seeking shelter against her larger form as she guided them through the maze of debris and rushing water that the storm had created. The return crossing of the swollen stream proved even more harrowing than the initial passage. The improvised log bridge had shifted further, and the water level had risen to the point where some sections were completely submerged. Elan waded into the torrent with the cubs clinging to her, their combined weight making balance precarious as the current tried to sweep them all downstream. At the deepest point, where the water reached her chest, the smallest cub lost its grip and began to be carried away by the rushing flow. Without hesitation, Elan lunged after it, catching the terrified animal just as it went under. The current slammed both of them against a partially submerged boulder, driving the breath from her lungs and sending stars exploding across her vision, but she held on. Through pain and disorientation, through the storm's continued assault and her body's protests, she held on. The cub in her arms trembled with cold and fear, but it was alive and safe. That was what mattered. That was all that had ever mattered. The final 100 meters to the outpost became a test of pure will. Elan's legs trembled with exhaustion, and her vision swam with approaching collapse. The cubs, sensing her distress, tried to support her as she had supported them, their small forms pressing against her sides as if to lend her their remaining strength. The outpost's emergency lighting appeared through the storm like a beacon of salvation, its warm glow promising safety and shelter for all four survivors. But as they approached the human facility, a new sound cut through the tempest, a roar that seemed to come from the very heart of the forest, deep and powerful and filled with urgency. The Rilvan pack leader emerged from the storm-lashed darkness like a mythical creature given form. His massive frame moved with surprising grace despite the treacherous conditions, his golden eyes blazing with an intensity that spoke of desperate search and parental terror. Behind him came two others, the cubs' parents. Elan realized, their relief at finding their young ones alive evident even across the species barrier. For a moment that stretched into eternity, human and Rilvan faced each other in the storm. The pack leader's posture was tense, ready for violence if this strange encounter proved to be a threat to his offspring. But the cubs broke the tension by rushing toward their parents, their high-pitched calls of joy cutting through the wind's howl. What happened next would be remembered by all who witnessed it as one of those rare moments when understanding transcends language and species. The cubs, instead of immediately seeking the safety of their pack, turned back toward Elan. The largest one, the one she had freed from beneath the stone, approached her slowly and touched its nose to her outstretched hand. The pack leader watched this interaction with eyes that seemed to weigh and measure. When his cub stepped back and made a sound that was clearly directed at him, the massive Rilvan took a step forward. His gaze met Elan's, and in that exchange, something fundamental shifted in the relationship between human and alien. The Rilvan leader lowered his great head in what could only be interpreted as a gesture of acknowledgement, perhaps even gratitude. It was not submission, nothing about his bearing suggested that, but rather recognition of a debt that transcended the complex politics of interspecies relations. One parent acknowledging another's sacrifice for the sake of young lives. Elan, her voice rusty from years of disuse, managed to speak her first words in nearly 3 years. They were scared. So was I. The pack leader's response was a sound that rumbled deep in his chest, not a growl of threat, but something that might have been understanding. Then, with a dignity that would have impressed diplomats, he gathered his cubs and disappeared back into the storm, leaving Elan standing alone in the outpost's entrance. Commander Reeves found her there 20 minutes later, when the storm had finally begun to show signs of weakening. She was sitting on the entry platform, her gear discarded around her, staring out into the forest with an expression he had never seen on her face before. When he asked what had happened, she simply said, "I helped some children get home." The remnants of his reconnaissance unit lay scattered across the dunes, victims of a perfectly executed ambush. Only he and 3 others had survived the attack by Khalil's rebel forces, the same rebels who had been terrorizing supply convoys for months. "Sir, movement at 2 o'clock, whispered Sergeant Torres, pointing toward a rocky outcropping. Marcus adjusted his scope and caught sight of a figure limping between the boulders, leaving a dark trail in the sand. The man wore the distinctive black tactical gear of Khalil's elite fighters, but something was wrong. He moved with the desperation of the wounded, not the confidence of a victor. "Could be a trap," Torres muttered, but Marcus was already moving. Something about the figure's struggle reminded him of his younger brother David, who had died in these same deserts 3 years ago. The enemy soldier collapsed just as Marcus reached him, revealing a face younger than expected, maybe 25. With intelligent dark eyes that held no hatred, only resignation. "American," the man whispered in accented English, blood frothing at his lips. "You came back for your dead." Marcus knelt beside him, instinctively checking the wound. A piece of shrapnel had punctured the man's lung, and without immediate medical attention, he would die within the hour. The logical choice was to leave him. This was the enemy who had just killed 7 of his men. Instead, Marcus found himself tearing his own shirt into bandages. "What's your name?" he asked, applying pressure to the wound. The young man's eyes widened in surprise and confusion. "Tariq," he gasped. "Tariq al-Rashid." As Marcus worked to stabilize him, Tariq spoke in fragments about his village, destroyed by a bombing that had killed his family. He hadn't chosen this war, it had chosen him. By nightfall, Marcus had dragged Tariq to a hidden cave system he remembered from previous patrols. Against all protocol, he shared his water and medical supplies with the enemy fighter. "Why?" Tariq asked as Marcus cleaned his wounds by flashlight. "Your men." "I helped kill them." Marcus paused, remembering David's final letter about the innocent civilians caught in this endless conflict. "Because you're someone's brother too," he said simply. For 3 days, they sheltered together while Tariq recovered enough to travel. They spoke of home, Marcus of his farm in Ohio, Tariq of the olive groves his grandfather had tended. Despite the language barrier and cultural divide, they found common ground in their love of family, their weariness with war, and their shared humanity. When Marcus finally helped Tariq to a neutral zone where he could seek proper medical care, both men knew something fundamental had changed. They were no longer just soldier and enemy, they had become, against all odds, something approaching friends. As Tariq disappeared into the crowd of a refugee camp, he turned back once. "If we meet again, Marcus Kane," he called out, "it will be as brothers, not enemies." Marcus nodded, not knowing how prophetic and tragic those words would prove to be. The war continued around them, but in that moment, two men had found peace in the midst of chaos, a peace that would soon be tested in ways neither could imagine. 6 months after their desert encounter, Marcus Kane found himself reassigned to a joint task force operating near the Syrian border. The mission was different now, not just combat, but hearts and minds, building bridges with local communities to isolate the extremist elements. It was during a routine patrol through the market district of a small border town that he saw a familiar face haggling over vegetables with an elderly vendor. Tariq al-Rashid had changed. Gone was the black tactical gear, replaced by simple civilian clothes and a slight limp that spoke of their shared ordeal in the desert. Their eyes met across the crowded marketplace, and for a moment, time seemed suspended. Then Tariq smiled, a genuine expression of joy that transformed his entire face. "Brother," he said simply as they embraced, ignoring the curious stares of onlookers and the nervous tension of Marcus's squad. Over tea in a small cafe, Tariq explained his transformation. After recovering from his wounds, he had abandoned Khalil's organization, disgusted by their increasing brutality toward civilians. "You showed me there was another way," he told Marcus. "When you saved my life, you saved more than just my body, you saved my soul from becoming something I would hate." Now he worked with a humanitarian organization, helping to resettle displaced families and providing intelligence about extremist activities to international peacekeeping forces. Their reunion came at a crucial time. Intelligence had identified a planned attack on a school inauguration ceremony, an event meant to symbolize hope and progress in the war-torn region. Khalil's forces intended to bomb the ceremony, killing not just military personnel but dozens of children and teachers. Traditional intelligence networks had failed to penetrate the cell planning the attack, but Tariq still had contacts within the organization. "I can get you the information you need," Tariq told Marcus over their second meeting. "But it will be dangerous. If they discover I'm working with Americans." He didn't need to finish the sentence. Both men knew the brutal fate that awaited traitors in Khalil's organization. Marcus studied his friend's face, seeing the determination mixed with fear. "You don't have to do this," he said. "We'll find another way." Tariq shook his head firmly. "Those children deserve a chance at education, at hope. My village had a school. Once I remember the joy on my sister's face when she learned to read." His voice grew thick with emotion. "If I can prevent other children from losing what we lost, then the risk is worth it." Over the next week, they worked together like the partners they had never expected to become. Tariq provided crucial intelligence. While Marcus coordinated the military response, their different perspectives and skills complementing each other perfectly, the operation was a complete success. The bomb plot was thwarted, the school ceremony proceeded safely, and several key members of Khalil's network were captured. As Marcus watched children laughing and playing in the new schoolyard, he felt Tariq's hand on his shoulder. "We did this," his friend said quietly. "Together, we saved these lives." It was a moment of pure triumph, a vindication of their unlikely friendship and proof that former enemies could indeed become the strongest allies, but even as they celebrated their success, dark clouds were gathering. Unknown to both men, their collaboration had been observed and reported. In the shadows of the intelligence world, plans were already being set in motion that would test their bond in ways they could never have imagined. The brotherhood they had forged in blood and trust was about to face its greatest challenge. In the months following the school rescue operation, Marcus and Tariq's partnership deepened into something neither had expected, a genuine friendship that transcended their different backgrounds and the ongoing conflict around them. They met regularly under the cover of intelligence briefings, but their conversations ranged far beyond military matters. Marcus shared stories of his childhood on the Ohio farm, while Tariq spoke of his dreams to rebuild his village once peace returned. Their collaboration had proven so effective that Marcus's superiors formalized the arrangement. Tariq became an official consultant to the Joint Task Force, his insights into local customs and extremist tactics proving invaluable. They worked together on humanitarian projects, distributing medical supplies, coordinating refugee assistance, and helping to rebuild infrastructure destroyed by years of warfare. The local population began to see Marcus not just as another foreign soldier, but as someone who genuinely cared about their welfare, largely due to Tariq's guidance and introduction during a particularly difficult mission to evacuate civilians from a contested village. Their trust was put to the ultimate test. Intelligence suggested the village harbored both innocent families and hidden weapon caches used by extremist cells. As they moved through the narrow streets, separating civilians from potential threats, an explosion rocked the building where Marcus was conducting interviews. Debris trapped him in a collapsed room with a suspected insurgent who had been injured in the blast. Tariq arrived first at the scene, armed and with a clear shot at the injured man, someone he recognized as a former comrade from his days with Khalil's organization. The man, bleeding and delirious, began shouting accusations at Tariq in Arabic, calling him a traitor and worse. For a moment, old loyalties and new commitments warred visibly on Tariq's face. Marcus, trapped but conscious, watched his friend struggle with the weight of his choices. "He's right, you know," Tariq said quietly in English, his weapon still trained on the wounded insurgent. "I am a traitor to everything I once believed." Marcus met his eyes steadily. "No," he said firmly. "You're a man who chose hope over hatred. That doesn't make you a traitor, it makes you brave." Tariq's hands trembled for a moment, then steadied. Instead of pulling the trigger, he holstered his weapon and began administering first aid to his former comrade. The rescue took 3 hours, with Tariq working tirelessly to clear debris while maintaining security. When Marcus was finally extracted, bruised but unharmed, he found Tariq sitting beside the insurgent, who was now stable and conscious. "He has information about planned attacks on civilian targets," Tariq explained. "I convinced him to talk." The intelligence they gathered that day prevented 3 separate bombing attempts, saving countless innocent lives.